It has been 5 years since we finished up the Junkyard 1-ton swap on the JKU, and about 1 year since our crate axles from Advanced Driveline got delivered for this JK. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another episode. So clearly we are talking about 1-ton axles in this video, and we're gonna kind of dive through not only how my Junkyard axles have held up, but also talk about crate axles and do a little pros and cons of each. Which setup might be best for you, what to look out for, and over time, how have these held up, and when should you think about spending the extra bit of money on some crate axles? We have a lot of stuff to go over in this video, and even if you aren't looking for 1-tons or you're not sure if you need 1-tons, we're gonna dive into that topic a little bit as well. So let's grab a whiteboard and sit down, start talking. So what exactly is a 1-ton axle and why would we want it under a Jeep? Well, simply put, a 1-ton axle is something that came from a 1-ton truck that's designed to tow, have a heavier payload, and really withstand the things that 1-ton trucks can do. Now, overall, the axles are bigger, but there's a lot of other things that come with that. And some of those things are a larger ring and pinion, which are the actual gear sets inside of our axles, larger axle shaft, larger brakes, unit bearings, steering knuckles, tubes, the actual thickness of the axle tubes themselves, and bigger ball joints and or kingpins. So all of these things, if you've ever owned a Jeep, they are known to break, whether you're snapping shafts, U-joints, ring and pinions, you're blowing through unit bearings and ball joints, bending axle tubes. All of these are larger typically on 1-ton axles, and the most common ones are going to be Dana 60 front axles, 70s, 80s rear, 14 bolts, Sterling's from the Ford, and all of these are full float axles. Now I put this over here, and one thing a lot of people talk about is full float axles. Typically every front axle with a unit bearing or spindle is going to technically be a full float. Now what full float versus semi-float means is how the weight of the vehicle is attached to the axle. So over here, this is a Super Duty unit bearing, and technically it is a full float axle because as the unit bearing attaches to the knuckle, the tire and wheel aren't putting any stress on the shaft that runs through the unit bearing. It's actually resting on the housing itself. Whereas a semi-float axle like this, which is a Jeep Gladiator Dana 44 rear axle shaft, is a semi-float axle shaft. So this slides into the housing just like here, and all of the weight of the vehicle is theoretically on the shaft itself and not on the housing. That's why pretty much every time you see a bent flange or a bent axle shaft, it's always going to be on the rear of a semi-float axle. You won't see it in the front, you'll actually just break the shaft. So moving over to a full float axle, we have spindles inside of here that our unit bearing and wheel sit on, and the shaft just rides out here to our outer hub. So there's no weight on the axle shaft, it's all sitting on the housing, which makes it a lot stronger because we're not putting the weight on the shaft, we're only putting the rotational force on the shaft. Now, out of this list of 1-ton axles, these are the most common ones on the market. There are a ton that are offered from various companies, and those are known as crate axles. They are built, designed by a company, all brand new parts delivered to your door, sometimes bare, sometimes ready to be installed under your Jeep. And that is what we're gonna talk about in this video. Before I start spewing out my opinion on junkyard swaps versus crate axle swaps, we're gonna break it down to a few facts. It is a fact that both of these Jeeps are theoretically running the same axles, Dana 60 front, 14 bolt rear. It is also a fact that you can save some money on some crate axles from Advanced Driveline using the discount code Gear and Gadgets. Whether you use it online or call in, it's gonna save you roughly 600 bucks on a full 1-ton setup, or you can even use that discount code on a built 44 or a semi-float 60 that's gonna bolt right into your Jeep using the same lug pattern. But both of the axles are theoretically the same, 60 and 14 bolt. On the Advanced Driveline setup, stepped up to 40 spline shafts, which means both in and outer shafts are 40 spline. Not only do we get more splines, we also get an increased diameter of an axle shaft. So it's a lot stronger. The DIY junkyards, when I'm saying this, I'm referring to what I did, which is a 2005 and up Super Duty Dana 60 and 99 to 06 14 bolt rear out of a 2500. So on the Junkyard axles, our front Dana 60 is going to be a 35 spline from the factory, which is pretty good. And the 14 bolt rear is going to be 30 spline, which also is still pretty decent, but upgrading to 40 spline shafts is definitely what you want to do if you're running a lot of horsepower, 42-inch tires or bigger, or if you're just really rough on it. That's where the 40 spline is going to come into play and just really hold up over time. The axle tubes themselves, spec'd out on the advanced driveline axles, moved up to 4-inch axle tubes, which is absolutely massive compared to the 3 3/4 on the Dana 60 and 3.5 on the 14 bolt in the rear. So both of these Dana 60s are running 1550 U-joints, both on the race Jeep and the Junkyard axle shafts. It originally came with the 1480s, but a very popular and easy upgrade for these 1-tons is throwing a set of 1550s in there. It's the same size U-joint, it's just spread out larger, which actually does give us a little bit of an upgrade, and these shafts just seem to be much stronger. Now for bolt patterns, they are different. So on the crate axles, went with 8 on 6.5, which is your typical 8-lug wheel bolt pattern. They're easier to find, there's a lot of options out there. Whereas the Junkyard swap went with 8 on 170, which is the Ford Super Duty bolt pattern. Now, in order to achieve that, we had to actually use adapters in the rear to match the front bolt pattern. And that also comes into play with the next thing, the width. The width of these axles went custom made once again, stepped up to 73.5 inches wide. Having a wider axle is going to let us run a wheel with less back spacing, which is actually going to help a lot in regards to steering. Our scrub radius is down, we have less load on our unit bearings, wheel bearings, and overall we can achieve the same width with a better wheel spec. Or we can run, 3.5-inch back spacing and get it out even wider. With that, we can also easily package coilovers, dual shock setups. It allows a lot more packaging without the frame and tire interference limitations that are typical on narrower axles. Now on the Junkyard swap, the front is 72 inches wide, which is still a lot wider than the factory JK width. Now the rear 14 bolt is only 69 inches wide. So that's also why I ran the rear adapters to match the front lug pattern, not only to make the bolt pattern the same, but also to make the overall width the same, running an 1.5 inch spacer adapter on both sides, comes out to 72 inches all around. Another great thing about moving up to these 1-ton axles is the pinion and caster separation. Even on our Junkyard Dana 60, we have a 10-degree pinion separation, which means if we're running a 5-degree pinion angle, we have 5 degrees of caster, opposed to the factory Jeep spec. In a JK, it's 6 degrees. So if we had a 4-degree pinion angle, we only have 2 degrees of caster. So 10 degrees of pinion separation is pretty good, big improvement over stock. But with the advanced driveline axles, we were actually able to spec it out and have them clock the tubes at 14 degrees. So I'm running on this, I think, 8 degrees of caster and 6 degrees of pinion angle, which has been fantastic. Long travel shocks, a ton of up travel and down travel. We're able to maintain a good pinion angle and great caster throughout all the range of travel. So that's one really cool thing. And a lot of this is that we're able to spec our axle out when we go to order it. Next up is ball joints versus Kingpins, everybody's favorite topic. The advanced driveline axle actually comes in a Kingpin, and it's called their Super Kingpin because we get a Kingpin reed C and their Super Kingpin outer, which is able to hold a 1550 shaft with Kingpins with the Ford unit bearing as well. So that's kind of a new thing to the market. It utilizes the benefits of Kingpins, but also the benefits of the Super Duty 60 setups. That's pretty recent. Now over on the Junkyard swap, we're either stuck with ball joints or ball joint deletes. I originally put in a set of ball joints, which are still much bigger than the factory Jeep ball joints, but they still tend to wear down over time. We upgraded to a set of ball joint deletes, which in design is very similar to a Kingpin, and it still has a lot of strength, You know, I'm not going to break down the differences between Kingpin and ball joint deletes in this video. I've been very happy with those, but I've also been very happy with how the Kingpins held up out at King of the Hammers. Next up is the correct pinion location on the advanced driveline. So the pinion location is right where it needs to be. There's no interference on the track bar, the frame, it's not offset, whereas the Super Duty 60 is actually offset a little bit to the driver's side. Isn't a big deal at low speeds, but if you're somebody who wants to use 4 high when you're going 60 miles an hour on the road, if you live somewhere very icy, you might start getting a little bit of pinion vibrations just due to that offset pinion. And last but not least, the rear axle on the advanced driveline setup has an incorporated shave, meaning the actual housing itself was redesigned for high clearance and to have a shave built into it. Where on my 14 bolt, I actually did the cheap route, which is the 13 bolt diff cover, which chops off that low hanging chunk of the 14 bolt and replaces it with only 13 bolts now. Now, there are pros and cons to both of these, and we're gonna talk about that next, but these are the facts and the difference in specs between this axle set and my Junkyard axle set. Well, it is finally time for some pros and cons. We're gonna ditch the whiteboard, and now it's time just to share a little bit of what I've experienced over the past couple years. You know, these axles, the Junkyard axle swap has been pretty good for the most part. Pros of this setup is going to be mostly cost. These are much more cost effective. I think when I first did this back in 2019, I was in the axles, drive shafts, and wheels for less than 10 grand. Now, of course, due to inflation, I bet if I was to replicate all of these parts again, it would be close to 13 or 14,000. Still cheaper than close to 20 grand for a set of crate axles. But on the flip side, we do have the cons to running a Junkyard setup. Outside of some of the things I just discussed, such as the pinion location, we also typically have to run a truss on these axles to make this swap happen. The truss is going to limit a little bit of possible up travel. As you can tell, we're running a ton of up travel on the race rig without any interference at all because we don't have to run a truss with the 4-inch axle tubes. They can just handle it. We also have to cut a major section out of our Super Duty axle housing. In order to fit a lower control arm over here on the driver's side, we have to remove about 1.5 inches out of the housing. Now on my axle, I actually cracked it. Even though I welded the tubes and it had the truss, I just romped on this thing that it actually cracked the housing right here along the bottom, and we started getting some negative camber to it. Now, luckily, I was able to pull it in spec, weld it, put a little mini truss on the bottom, but that is one of the cons overall of running a DIY Junkyard set. If this axle had completely snapped, we would have been out an axle and I would have had to redo this all again. And that leads into one of the major pros of crate axles is that they come with a warranty. 5 years on the axle housings themselves, unlimited lifetime warranty on shafts. So having the warranty and peace of mind on axles like this, if you're building a rig where you're gonna go out and abuse it, having that warranty is beautiful because if you end up breaking it, you're gonna have to fix it. Another big thing people talk about with the Junkyard swaps is the time and labor involved in building these. You have to be able to weld, you have to be able to set up your gears. In order to make all of this cost effective and actually benefit from the cost savings of doing your Junkyard axles, you're gonna have to be pretty mechanically involved and you're gonna spend a lot of time working on these axles. Now, I know a lot of people say that, oh, I don't have the time for it, or you're not counting your man labor hours into the cost of building these, and that really depends. If you're somebody who's working non-stop and you're actually making a ton of money and your time is money, then yeah, these might not be for you. You're gonna be better off going with a set of crate axles. But if you're saying that time is money and you spend your afternoons watching TV, sitting on the couch, then that's kind of irrelevant because you're just spending your time however you want. You're not really making any money anyway, so maybe your time isn't worth it. You need to get off your butt and start working on stuff. So that's one thing to think about before you go into the whole Junkyard 1-ton swap route is there's a lot of time removing all the old bracketry from the axles. A lot of time welding, setting up gears, building these things to be able to go on a Jeep that's gonna go down the highway. Whereas these, you swipe a credit card and you can bolt them up under your Jeep. Now, in this specific case of crate axles, they were not bolt-in ready, but they are offered in a JK platform, JL platform, JT platform, to be able to bolt in directly under your Jeep, all the factory bracketry in place. You can also spec it out. Suppose you're running a 3-link from Rockcrawler or Clayton, and you want them to go ahead and put those brackets on, they can do that as well. Advanced Driveline is the same crew from Offroad Elements up in Massachusetts, and they are fantastic people, great customer service, and very knowledgeable in Jeep. So, you know, a lot of people hear the name Advanced Driveline, they say, oh, I've never heard of that, but that's who they are. They make fantastic axles, and I didn't hesitate. I ran them on the King of the Hammers Jeep, and they survived fantastically. But back to pros and cons. Typically, your crate axles are going to be stronger than a set of Junkyard 1-ton axles. And in our case with the Advanced Driveline axles, everything was overbuilt compared to what I did on the Junkyard spec. So in that case, everything was bigger and stronger. There are certain companies and certain crate axles that aren't as strong as a Super Duty Dana 60 and a 14-bolt rear. You know, a Dana 60 rear axle definitely has its limitations. And since I've done this swap, there's been plenty of things that I've had to upgrade. That's one thing I haven't talked about yet. Even after we did this, I had to go through and change out to worn hubs because I blew the factory hubs. I had to weld the housing back together. I did have one of my high steer arms crack, and I had to go through and re-weld that with some nickel iron rod. And that's something I would recommend, and I'll put down in the video description. If you're going through and building these for your first time, get some of that nickel iron rod. It's going to hold up better. Steering, that's another thing. There's a lot of different options for high steer arms. Unfortunately, these Barnes 4-wheel drive high steer arms aren't available anymore. They switched over to a different style. These, while we still retain a lot of the turning radius, we lose out on a little bit. Whereas on some of the crate axles, we get a high steer arm that's perfectly centered from our Kingpin to our drag link mount that's going to match exactly turn to turn compared to the factory JK spec. Now on the race Jeep, we're not running that. We're running double shear setup just for extra strength, but I do need to move this back to the back hole to get a little more steering radius out of it. But it becomes very opinionated on this topic, and I don't have a definite answer on which one's better. Both of them have their place for certain individuals. If you have the money and you're looking for something with a warranty, something that you're not gonna have to mess with all the time, the crate axles just shine. If you have time, if you're mechanically inclined, and you don't mind kind of dealing with some of the small stuff, the Junkyard 1-tons are gonna fit the bill and they save you a lot of money. It really depends on exactly what you're looking for. If you wanna go out in your Jeep, romp on it, hit it hard, crate axles are the way to go. If you are going to break a ring and pinion and you don't mind fixing it yourself, go with a set of Junkyard tons. So if there's only one thing you take away from this video, is that ultimately the choice, there's no clear choice. It really depends on exactly what you want out of your Jeep and what you want to do with it. Both of these are fantastic options, and you can't go wrong with either of them. It really just depends on what you want to do with it. Personally, if it was me and I was building a new Jeep that I really wanted just to work all the time, I'd go with crate axles. If I was building another JK that I didn't mind tinkering around with for a while, I'd probably go with the Junkyard axles. Both have their pros and cons, both are fantastic axles. And that leads us into our last point on what if you don't want to go with 1-tons? They are heavy, they're wide, they're big. There's always an option to do an upgraded set of Dana 44s, thicker tubes, better caster pinion angle separations, that 10-degree, and they're bolt-in ready. You can keep your same wheels. Advanced Driveline also offers those 44 front, 60 rear, and you can even move up to a 40 spline rear semi-float Dana 60. Now, a lot of people say, hey Ben, I thought you were talking about semi-floats being bad. They bend the shafts. Well, there are certain upgrades you can do. You can run a bigger bearing set with a bigger shaft that's gonna handle that increased load and still be more than fine on something like 40s, as long as you're kind of smart on how you go off-road. One of my favorite stages of this JK build was on the built 44s and 37s. It was just right in that middle ground. It was plenty fun, still plenty strong, and the Jeep was still light enough and nimble enough to play around with. So 1-tons aren't for everybody. They are heavy, they're wide, they're big, they're cumbersome, more expensive to maintain, and a 44 front and a 60 rear setup would still be fantastic. So I know there's a lot to unpack in this video, but hopefully this answered some questions for people. I've had numerous questions and people requesting to make this video, kind of going through and nitpicking the differences between these axles and what I would recommend. And short and sweet, it's hard for me to recommend because it ultimately depends on you. Thanks for watching, guys. Like always, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. We'll see you later.